Okay, let's talk more about reductions to potential GDP. I've kind of mentioned this already. Why do capital taxes and labor income taxes reduce productive capacity? Well, these are very, very important inputs to the nation's productive ability. So that's just a reinforcement of something, and the content here is on the slide is something that I said verbally earlier. Then there's the concept of capital stock. So I'm talking about that K variable of 5-6 slides ago. This is the total stock in dollar value of all the equipment and all the structures in the economy owned by the private sector, right? So you go to any large city in this country and you look at the skyscrapers, those are almost all privately owned. Occasionally there might be one that's government, but oftentimes they're privately owned, office buildings, that kind of thing. Those are structures. Those would be in this capital stock measure I'm talking about. All the computers owned by the private sector that are used in business, in day-to-day business, would be included. Pens and paper would be included. So that's conceptually what I'm talking about here. And it takes time for a country. Think of a new country that starts out, and most new countries start out with very little, whenever it is that they start, and they build their cities over time, right? They accumulate the computers and all the different kinds of printing presses and whatever, all types of equipment over time. So that's what I'm talking about when I say it takes time to accumulate up to the long run equilibrium capital stock. But once they've been working on accumulating up to where they have all the buildings, they have all the equipment, they have the printing presses, all the pencils, all that stuff that they need, then they don't have to invest so heavily, right? And so what happens is the capital stock gets to what we call a long-run equilibrium, where it plateaus in real terms, right? And we don't have to invest quite so hard because we've got all the buildings, we've got all the computers, we've got what we need, right? So that's the concept of a long-run equilibrium capital stock. Well, one of the kinds of revenue side government policies that we've talked about has a negative impact on this idea, on this concept, on this long-run capital stock concept, and that is the capital income and or capital gains tax. The other ones don't, but that particular tax is a particularly bad one on the economy for the government to raise, and it's because of the previous effects already mentioned, as well as this one, which is it brings down that equilibrium level of capital stock. Right, so if the government decided to raise capital income tax or the capital gains tax, say from 25% to 30%, then the economy is going to go into an adjustment phase that might take 5 years, something. And during that adjustment, that equilibrium level of capital stock would come down. Okay, so we would have fewer buildings, fewer computers, fewer printing presses, all those kinds of things. The reasoning is similar. It's a disincentive to the capital accumulation process. It's just a very long-term conceptual discussion of the stock of capital in the economy that is unique from what I talked about before. Okay, let's switch to expenditure side. What I'm going to do initially on expenditure side policies is talk about the gross effects. What do I mean by that? These are the effects free of financing. In other words, these are the effects on the economy if the government didn't have to pay, if it didn't have to raise the money that it's going to use then to spend on these items. Public capital on the infrastructure side, public capital, non-infrastructure, and government expenditure. So a very important thing happened in macroeconomic theory in roughly the 80s. Before that, economists hadn't realized how important it was to distinguish the types of things the government might spend on, like I've done here. So I have these three categories. So this is a relatively modern theoretical advancement in the field of economics. Okay, so if the government spends $1 trillion on roads and bridges and so on and so on. That's going to be in this first category here. And what this analysis on this slide assumes is that somebody just gave them the $1 trillion for free. They didn't have to raise that money. And when I say somebody, it's like, someone outside the economy that we're talking about. It just dropped from heaven, or it came from a Martian or someone, some entity from outside the economy we're talking about just hands the government $1 trillion. Okay, so given that assumption, the free financing assumption, what happens in the economy? A lot of good things. You can see the short-run GDP, the GDP expenditure side or spending side go up for all of these categories. That's intuitive because if you go back to this formula here, the C plus I plus G plus NX, we're boosting G. Nothing changes to CI or NX. So, okay, my GDPE, my short-run GDP will rise. Let's go back down. Yeah. Okay, so we have benefits to short-run economic activity measured for the entire economy, i.e. GDPE, for all of these categories of spending. And it's good as well for long-term GDP for the most part. The only one that doesn't really enter into the long-term or the productive capacity is government expenditure, because that doesn't show up in that formula that I had earlier where I talked about the key inputs to our productive capacity, this formula here in the lower half of this slide here. What is this? Slide 8, right? The GDPP is a function of that. The F just means is a function of these key inputs, capital, labor, and public capital. Well, the government expenditures doesn't show up here as something that we believe is important to free financing, is important to the nation's productive capacity. So no effect, null or no effect. Well, that's a strange world. Doing the analysis where the $1 trillion came from heaven or came from a Martian is kind of a strange analysis. Not the world we live in, is it? We have to generate that money somehow. Okay, so now these are what I call net effects or net of financing. We have to get the money. We have to get the $1 trillion in order to spend it. What we're going to assume here is that the government floats some debt to get the $1 trillion initially. But then, like I've talked about before, they're going to have to retire some of that debt by raising taxes. One of the 3 taxes that we talked about, in fact, the sales tax, the capital income tax, or the labor income tax. Those are our 3 dominant taxes at the federal level. So they're going to have to raise one of those taxes at some point in the future to retire some of the debt. So I have a little paragraph at the bottom here that says just that. These results presume initial financing is via debt, where eventually the debt's paid off by raising taxes on capital or labor income. Okay. So the short-term effects are still good. They're still up, right? If government decides to spend more on any one of these 3 categories, again, that's because of the GDPE formula here, C plus I plus G plus NX, and I've got G, some component of G is rising, okay? Net of financing, okay, so this is slide 13. We're on expenditure side, net of financing. Long-term or GDP or productive capacity of the economy. Really the only category the economists believe is going to be beneficial after you net out financing is infrastructure. So there have been a lot of measurements in the field, in academic research papers about, okay, what's the impact of infrastructure? What's the impact of public capital but non-infrastructure public capital? What's the impact of government expenditures? Really only infrastructure clearly rises up and seems to be a strong enough impact, positive impact, that positivity, if you will dominate the fact that, hey, the debt is going to have to be retired through raising taxes. By raising taxes, from what we studied before on the revenue side, we know that pulls GDP down. So, okay, then which of these effects is bigger, right? The boost from infrastructure spending versus the detriment to GDP by raising taxes to pay for the debt for the infrastructure spending. It appears like infrastructure is the only one strong enough to net positive once you take into account the fact that taxes in the future are going to rise. Okay, a little bit more about the comment. These results presume initial financing is debt where eventually debt's paid off. Debt financing can't be continued too long and in many episodes of time because the interest payments can explode, particularly when interest rates are a little bit higher. These days, last few years, interest rates have been historically low. But in more normal historical times, when interest rates are a little bit higher, interest payments can start accumulating on you in kind of a crazy way. And that is why in normal times, borrowing is seen as unsustainable in the long run. And that's why I have said, previous slide, and I think a few slides prior to that look, they can float the debt initially to pay for a project, some kind of road they want to build, some kind of interstate, some kind of medical hospital, whatever it is. But at some point, they're going to have to raise taxes to retire some of that debt. That's why I say that, because just letting the debt sit there and rolling it over is going to lead to exploding interest payments. Okay. The net impacts are different because I think I've motivated that pretty well. The government does, in fact, have to pay for their projects. They have to get money on the revenue side somehow. And even if they initially borrow, they're going to later raise taxes. And we know taxes are bad on the economy. So that's why on the expenditure side, economic effects, the net impacts are quite different for the productive capacity of GDP, the long-term GDP, than the gross effects. Okay, to conclude, the taxes that are commonly used for the bulk of tax revenues at the federal level are harmful to the economy, both short-term and long-term. And government expenditures, it comes in two broad types. There's sort of a consumption side and an investment side, and infrastructure investment especially. So when the government invests in infrastructure, from what it appears, based on the various academic papers that are out there, those are the ones that probably net of financing as being positive to the economy. That's it for fiscal policy.